All right. So this week, we're talking about the fall of the Northern Kingdom. I've done, as I mentioned last week, a little bit of structuring of our schedule. And so just because for the month of December, we'll just be having a small mini session, or at least there will be two small mini sessions, and I'll be teaching one of them over the post-exilic period. And so I figured we probably should talk a little bit about the exile in this class for those who want to continue on into December and the post-exile time. But if not, it's also good to talk about the exile. So we are moving up a little quicker than I had initially planned, but that is fine because the fall of the North is, it seems like it should be at the end of the class, but there's a whole lot more of the history of Judah than the history of the Northern Kingdom of Israel. As we have been doing, I'm giving us a map. Uh-oh, one of my slides is missing and stuff. Okay, sorry, I'm looking ahead. So we have a map. I've shown you guys this map before. This is a map of Assyria, more than it is a map of Israel. But what is happening in this week is the Assyrians are no longer in this darker green. They are moving down into Israel. They'll of course spare Judah because Judah has God on their side still. However, Assyria doesn't just stop once they've conquered Israel. They keep going. I think that's a good reminder of Assyria was the power at the time, but of course they don't last because we know from our study of Jeremiah on Sunday mornings, Babylon will be the one to come and usurp the Assyrians, and they will be the ones to deliver Judah into exile. And of course, looking ahead from that, even Babylon doesn't last because then the Persians come, and then we can go through all of the history of the empires ad nauseum.
Where is Babylon at this point?
Babylon is,
or doesn't exist at this point?
It's not as a unified country or nation at this time.
So they
it would be
that dog leg right there.
Yeah, it's in like this area.
So they're not unified, but then they get unified and they take over Syria.
It's it's one of those. It's a nation group that has been conquered by the Assyrians, and so they will revolt. Similar to how the Moabites and the Edomites revolted against Israel and Judah. They are their own people, but at the same time, for most of their history, they're under the Assyrian Empire, and they'll exchange. The same thing with the Persians. The Babylonian people don't just stop existing. They'll just be conquered by the Persians, and so it just becomes one of those ethnically diverse areas. I'm going to click on this slide and see if things pop up. So there is stuff there. It's just not shown on the preview. This will be our only kind of topic about Judah this evening, just because it kind of changes what Israel looks like. So Amaziah, the son of Jehoash, king of Judah at this time, he does one thing that's recorded in Second Kings. And what he does is he decides, I'm going to go up and fight the northern kingdom of Israel. He's wicked. He's continuing the sins of his forefathers. And he decides, I'm going to go and attack the northern kingdom. This is important because for the northern kingdom, they have this, great grandson of Jehu, King Jeroboam II, which I have always thought was weird, especially when I started looking into like the family lines, how Jeroboam II is not at all related to the first Jeroboam, and yet it makes it seem like he's Jeroboam Jr., but that's not necessarily the case. But what happens is Jeroboam, who is again one of those kings that we can prove, or we have archaeological proof of, or at least we have proof that he had seals made, which is this is a better version of like the actual seals, because they were recreated. Because the actual seals look like they've been buried or kept in poor condition for thousands of years, because they have. And so they recreated this, and so we know he was one of the kings that, though he was not a king of Judah, he viewed himself as being a lion, similar to the kings of Judah. He saw himself as this chosen king, and it's significant because, or this attack by Amaziah is significant because what happens is Judah becomes a subject of Jeroboam. They'll get their independence once the Assyrians start attacking, but what we see is the northern kingdom has one last strong stand of we are reuniting the kingdoms just in time to everyone to just kind of give up on keeping the kingdoms united. And so Jeroboam, though he's not related by blood necessarily to Jeroboam the first, he continues in all the sins of Jeroboam. And what is interesting is he's one of those who reinstitutes the worshiping of the golden calves. A couple weeks ago, I guess it was last week, not a couple weeks ago. Last week we mentioned how Jehu turned the people away from the sins of Jeroboam and Ahab by destroying the Baals and the golden calves. However, now Jeroboam, his great grandson, is saying, no, let's go back to worshiping the golden calves. And he installs the heifer of Gerashim, and it's one of those. This is basically a temple for the golden calf, and it becomes a big deal, just like it was for Jeroboam the first. However, what we see is there's three prophets that emerge during the reign of Jeroboam the second. The first one, I think we all kind of know, but it's not because he goes and talks to Jeroboam. He actually would rather go talk to Jeroboam than go talk to the Assyrians, and that's Jonah. Jonah is during this time, he's actually mentioned as being a king, not a king. What am I talking about? Being a prophet that wants to go and minister in the king's court, and is good at it. That's what he's good at. He's good at doing those things. But instead he is told, no, you need to go talk to the Assyrians. And so we get this, we know the story. Whether it's a fish or a whale, I don't think that's the part we need to be arguing about. It was coincidental, not on purpose. Whether it's a fish or a whale, that's not the thing that we should be taking away from the story. The story is clearly one that Jesus will reference as there's going to be a sign of Jonah that he is going to partake in, whether we want to say that is the 3 days that Jonah spent in the belly of the fish, the whale, versus the 3 days that Jesus will spend in the grave, whether it's this prophet who's been sent to the Gentiles to give a message of hope and deliverance, versus well, I guess Jonah did do that. He just got very upset when the Gentiles repented, because it's really hard for him to see how these Assyrians could be the good guys, because especially in Jonah's time. Let's go back to the map. Yeah, they're probably still more like the dark green color, but the border of the northern kingdom kind of ends here. And so the Assyrians have probably moved a little bit further south into the region of Tyre and Sidon. And so now these are the neighbors to the north. And those whispers of, well, we don't like them because they're not like us. They do things slightly different, but it's not just that. Assyrians were doing a lot different than the people of Israel. They were skinning Israelites alive and wearing the skins around as trophies. They were everything that the Torah said, this is an unclean thing. They would say, what are you talking about? We're going to do that anyways. They had no problem with intermarriages or immoral sex lives. They had no problem with eating whatever food they found. They had no problem. They had no concern for health regulations really at all. And it's one of those, yeah, to a Jew, no matter how religious you were, to look to the north and say, they are categorically the most opposite to us that I could possibly imagine. And yet you're telling me, God, I need to go minister to them. I need to go proclaim good news to them. So beyond just the fear of, well, they're going to kill me. I'm an Israelite. I'm a Jew. There's also that I don't want my enemy to be saved. And of course, we see Jonah struggle through all 4 chapters of Jonah through this part. And so, yeah, Jonah really struggles with that and also how he relates with God. And then another prophet we get is Amos. Amos is brought up because, and he's a shepherd. So he's what we could think of. Oh, let's think of another way the prophets are like Christ. Well, Christ is described as a prophet. Amos is a shepherd. Wait, no, I mixed that up. Christ is described as a shepherd. Amos is a shepherd, and they're both called to be prophets. And what had happened in Amos, well, for Amos to be called, was Israel had become powerful. We saw how they have subjugated the southern kingdom. They had reclaimed a lot of land from their enemies. They've resubjugated Moab and Edom and Ammon and even parts of Syria, not Assyria, but Syria. And so what we see is they've become a little too big for their britches, as some might say. And they've gone into pagan worship. They've done all this. And what Amos is called to do is deliver a message of judgment to the king. He is supposed to be delivering this message that your sins will not be forgiven forever. It's not that God won't forgive sins. That's not the message. Some people are like, Amos is a whole lot more hard-nosed than the other prophets. Well, no, it's because he's looking at one of the more evil kings of Israel, and he's telling them, you are having success, yes. You're exceeding in wealth. You're growing the kingdom of Israel, but you are not going to escape the wrath of God for the sins you've done, the wickedness you've done. You've led his people away, just like a poor shepherd leads his sheep astray, so you have done, and you will be punished for those actions. But of course, it's never that week. It's never that time. The king always will probably die on his deathbed of, well, I guess I escaped that because the worst thing that happened to me was dying, and everyone dies. And so it's one of those, we can say, yes, he spoke it directly to Jeroboam II, but I think it's more of this prophecy was on the whole northern kingdom. Because what we will see is he does, or the northern kingdom does fall. It does have to answer for the sins of their kings and their people. And that leads us to the last prophet, Hosea. Hosea is a lot more, I guess, nice of a message to receive, especially if you're a king. So Hosea is giving this message of love and forgiveness, and the message is, yes, you need to repent, but if you don't, that's kind of okay. You'll still be given forgiveness. There will be hope for you still. But what happens is he really runs up to the problem of Israel, no matter how nice and sugar-coated this message is still not going to repent, just like they didn't repent to a harsh message, just like, and so looking back to Jonah, it's especially weird that Jonah kind of gave a fire and brimstone sermon to the Assyrians in Nineveh, and they all said, cool, we're in. And of course that made Jonah upset, but it's one of those, the Israelites don't seem to be getting what the Assyrians are getting, even though the Assyrians got a very reluctant fire and brimstone sermon compared to a sermon of probably a little bit more fire and brimstone, but also a very sugar-coated sermon, and they still don't turn around. The spiritual decline of the northern kingdom continues. Of course, they're embracing idols, they're embracing false prophets, and they are becoming more concerned with material possessions. Hosea is very it's one of his main concerns is you are becoming way too dependent and concerned with material possessions, and you are not paying attention to your spirits. You're not paying attention to the religious side of what you're supposed to be doing. And Hosea backs up straight to 722, which is the year the Israelites go into captivity. And so it's one of his is a little interesting because you kind of get to see he's telling them and he's preaching up to this point of they're going into captivity, similar to Jeremiah. And it's just one of those, he is kind of defeated of, I did this and I gave you the sugar-coated message. I gave you this message of love and forgiveness, and you're still never thought, yeah, this is sounds better than what Amos said about, yes, if I continue down this path, it's going to be a terrible time, and I'll be forgiven and I'll love, and it still doesn't happen. Which Jeremiah also struggles with, but he's been doing this for 40 years to the same crowd with the same message, and it's one of those, how many times can I beat my head against the wall before you just listen to me? And so that's kind of where the three prophets that happened in the time of King Jeroboam is or are. I'm going to stop here. Does anyone have any questions so far? If not, I can keep talking. That's not a problem for me.
So I'm tracking. You saying that Jonah, Hosea, and Amos are all prophets for the northern kingdom.
In the time, well, Jonah's not. He's to the Assyrians.
Okay.
But yes, Amos and Hosea are to the northern kingdom, but all three are under the in the time of Jeroboam II.
Okay.
And so it's one of those, whether you want to say this message of what Jonah preached got back to the northern kingdom around this time or not, it's one of those where you kind of have to sit there and wonder if, especially for those who are returning from exile, and they have the prophets all there, and they're reading through Jonah and Amos and Hosea, and they know the history a little bit better than we do, and they're seeing, well, this sounds very similar to kind of what we're going through. We're on the brink of being. The Greeks are at the doorstep, the Romans are at the doorstep, and yet it's the outsiders, the ones who are conquering that heard the message of the prophets and repented. And it's not us. And so I think that's a little bit convicting for those who read their prophets and read that material. And I think it's something to remember because it makes sense with looking towards the New Testament. The gospel was first to the Jews, right? Well, the Jews, to some extent, responded well to Christ. Some would say they didn't respond well to Christ because that's why he died on the cross. And so it's one of those, then you get the message or the missionary journeys of the apostles, and especially the apostle Paul, and you see this incredible growth in the church of the Gentiles are just eating up the message of the gospel. They are willing, like I'm sure Saul, not Saul, well, I guess Saul. Saul later called Paul, probably wasn't always giving the best sermon at the synagogue or in the town squares. Yes, Acts records a lot of good ones, but I'm sure it wasn't every time he got up to speak was a perfect sermon. But it was one of those, he was gaining, like crowds were following him. People were hungering for what he was writing and teaching just because they wanted the gospel message. And I think even looking here, you see it with the Assyrians. They're Gentiles. They have no relation to this God other than they know it's the God of the people they're about to conquer. And they're wanting to get the forgiveness of that God more than the Jews are wanting that forgiveness. Or I guess at this time it's still the Israelites. So the Israelites are wanting that more. The Israelites want to be like the other nations, where the other nations want to be like Israel. I think that's interesting. But did that answer your question? Okay. So Jeroboam II, he actually reigns quite a long time for being considered a wicked king. He reigns for 41 years, and his son Zechariah will become king after him. Zechariah does not last very long. I'm just realizing I don't. Yeah, sorry. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. So Zechariah reigns for 6 months. Not a very long time at all. It's one of those. It's a very quick turnaround. But what happens is one of the generals says, "You know what? I'm tired of this family being king. I'm tired of these people." And so what happens is the general thinks, "Well, I could be king." And that always works out super great for everyone involved, is when generals start thinking that they're better than the king. Because yes, the general, and I don't have it in front of me, for those who are reading their Bibles currently. Shallum, there we go. I have all the other names. I forgot Shallum, or to be in my notes. Shallum says, "All right, I'm going to become king." And of course, this is to fulfill the prophecy that was made to Jehu of your sins will be forgiven to the 4th generation. Yes, this happens several times. It goes back to Ahab. The same kind of promise was made to Ahab. But again, it really goes back to Exodus 34, verses 5 through 7, when it's one of those passages where you get the description where God is describing himself to Moses. The Lord, gracious and abounding in steadfast love, full of forgiveness. There's a lot of things happening here. And then it's describing steadfast to the generations, not forgiving iniquity, but forgiving them to the 3rd, 4th generation. And so it's one of those, this pattern is showing back up again. It shows up a lot in the Old Testament and I'm sure if we really wanted to study genealogies, which I'm sure all of you are super into, if we wanted to study genealogies, we could probably count down every 3rd or 4th and see, oh wait, so here was a good king 3 or 4 generations down. Here's a really bad king, and 3 or 4 generations down, the punishment came due, or something happened like that. Well, the punishment has come due for Jehu's house, and so of course Shallum decides, all right, I want to be king. Very similar to what Zimri and Tibni wanted to do back before Ahab became king, or I guess before Omri became king, which led to Ahab becoming king. But it was one of those moments of, well, I think I could be a better king. And then, of course, the general marches up and kills the king. And then some other general says, I'm loyal to the king, but also I think I'm a better king than you, so I'm going to go kill you. So Shallum only lasts 1 month on the throne. He's not the shortest. That was Tibni, and he was there for a week. And so it was one of those, it was a very quick turnaround, but not the quickest turnaround. And that leads us to Mahan. He's a king. Again, the more significant parts is just his, he was king for a couple years. Yeah. One thing that is interesting is this Iran stele. Similar to some of the other steles we've seen in the past, steles are just monuments built by kings detailing a battle, especially their victories, and they'd leave them purposefully in the area that they conquered or slightly off. And so sometimes they moved from where they were, but this was discovered in 1868. It honors Tiglath-Pileser the third. He's, of course, the leader of Assyria, but by this time, it's describing basically who pays him taxes. It's a very boring stele. It's not describing a battle. It's not describing who the enemies are or how great the king is. It's just describing who's paying taxes. And so it's one of those of, we see how Manam or Maham, king of Israel, by this point, Israel shrunk. It is no longer over the southern kingdom, and it is paying taxes to the Assyrians. It is paying tribute to the Assyrians, because if we pay them enough, maybe they won't destroy us. And so, oh, yes.
So there's words on, that's the stele to the
Yes.
right, and there's words on it?
Yes.
Okay.
So not on this. It's a
Okay.
very weathered stele.
Okay.
And museums love taking very low quality pictures.
Oh, yeah, that's.
And so it's one of those, they took a picture of a rock that's been weathered. But this side is really just a guy standing there. It's attributed,
Oh, that's his arm.
yeah, this is his arm.
Oh,
His head,
and his head,
his
I see it
feet.
now.
It's,
Oh, I see.
yeah, it's not super great. But of
But
course,
it's really old.
it's really old, because this is describing, it's describing a invasion that happened in 743 BC. So this is 8th century BC, and it's one of those moments where you have to think that is well over 2,000 years, almost 3,000 years ago. And we're trying to take a picture of this rock that has been outside for most of that. And so it's one of those, of course, it's not in a super great condition, but the words would be on the opposite side.
Oh, okay,
It-
it's like like.
It'd be like a baseball card, just a very
Oh.
heavy baseball
Oh,
card,
okay.
where like the picture's on front and then all of the information's on the back. And so it's one of those, yeah, it was one of those that, of course, the Babylonians, that's why it's in Iran. And it's called the Iran stele, because what happens is the Assyrians set this up, was assumed in the northern kingdom of Israel. And because it's a rock from that area, they wanted to make it very well known who's king here, who pays who taxes. And so it's one of those where you have to sit there and think, yay, I'm so glad this is the poster that I get to hang up in my bedroom. And so it's one of those, what happens is when the Babylonians come to power, they end up cutting it off of the base. Whether that was a base because it was built more as they cleared the rock around it and then set it up, or if it was more of they set a stone there, but the base made it just way too heavy. Anyway, what happens is they chop the top off and they move it somewhere into closer to Babylon. Because what happens when the Persians come is this is then moved once again further into Iran, which is where the Persians were. And so that's why it's the Iran stele. It was found in a cave in Iran. Super great labeling. Archaeologists have very creative ways of labeling things. We'll get to this in a few weeks of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's all like labels, but it's all, or letters that are abbreviations. So it's like PAQ Isaiah 2. Well, that just means it's the PA is just the guy's name. It was found in Qumran, so Q, Isaiah, scroll 2. Like, it's not a very interesting way of labeling it all. It's just who found it, where it was found, what it is, and how many of this is this. And so the same thing with these steles. It's either it's either labeled after what it's describing, or it's labeled after where they found it. And it's interesting. This is the Iran stele because when the Muslims took over the Middle East, there's a lot of archaeology that was just destroyed because they have very strict policies in their religion of graven images and what statues can or can't be made and what records can and can't be kept. And so a lot of these findings are because they're just found in caves. If Qumran was more of just a library that was wide open. And when the Muslims came through, we wouldn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls. There would not be these copies of Isaiah that are extensive and complete, and there's a lot, like, it's in the same like verbiage that the Gospels record. And of course, it's a Hebrew translation turned into a Greek translation in the Gospels. But what happens is it's one of those, I'm getting ahead of myself. Jesus, when he quotes from Isaiah in the Gospel of Matthew, for a while it threw off a lot of scholars because they're like, this doesn't sound like the Masoretic text, the version of the Old Testament Hebrew we have. So is Jesus quoting some line that we don't know from Isaiah? It sounds like this other line, but it's not quite. Well, going back to this Dead Sea Scroll, they have it in the version that Christ is said to have said, and because if we take that line and translate it to Greek, it's what Christ said, or what he's recorded saying. That's way too far ahead of myself. But it's one of those, it's important that this was found where it was found, and it's one of the only things that are found there, because a lot of archaeology in the Middle East got destroyed, and a lot of these artifacts. So these small little things that we find, it wasn't like they were destroying it because they didn't want people to prove the Bible. It was they were just destroying it because Islam said, no, you don't have statues of kings, you don't have statues of gods, you don't have any of this, you have to destroy it. Anyway, now that rabbit hole is over, and we'll go on, and then we get it gets confusing. I'm gonna have to pull it up and look at my Bible, just because, of course, they don't actually spell it the way I'm used to saying it. So this is 2 Kings, I'm guessing 16.
For Menahim, or for Pekah.
Yeah, that one.
Pekah. I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, give me a second. Yeah, Pekahiah reigns in Israel. It's the 15th year of Azariah, king of Judah. He reigns over Israel for 2 years. He's one of those that he has a very weak claim to the throne, but he gets it because he's there at the right time. But interestingly enough, slightly different name, different guy. Pekah usurps his authority as in the throne. It's a little interesting because he's described as being king for 20 years. It has only been like 17 years up to this point of since Jeroboam II died. Actually, no, it's 17 years from when he ends up or he stops being king to Jeroboam. And so the question is, well, how can this be? What did the Bible just get it wrong? I'm not going to say that. The Bible probably didn't get it wrong. What probably is happening is it's described as he reigns in Samaria. Well, a king doesn't have to necessarily reign in Samaria to be king. We see this with going back to David. David was king before he ever ascended to the throne, right? Before he ever, he was king before he faced Goliath. He was king because he was anointed king. And so what we can probably assume is Pekah has been kind of a pretender. He's been ruling in the capital city. That doesn't mean he's king. Jeroboam II didn't stop being king as soon as he walked outside of the city. Jeroboam II was still king, but Pekah was calling himself king for 20 years. And so it's one of those, you had the generals fighting, and you have to remember they were fighting off an invasion from the north. So all these kings and generals, they're not in the capital city. They're on the front lines. They're fighting this war. And so, of course, it's super easy for the guy who got to stay behind to say, yeah, I'm king. I'm in charge now. but I'm not going out to go fight in the war. And of course, there's no armies to overthrow me in the capital because they're not here. Who's going to overthrow me now? Is it going to be the women and children? I didn't think so. It's yeah, it's kind of. No, I'm not going to go there. Sorry. It's one of those where you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. What, like this, like, but it's just one of those you have to remember because we see it in our movies and our shows and our books and all of this. It's not a foreign concept for some guy to just be the guy who got to stay behind and gets to claim authority. Yeah, he's not the king. The king's been disgraced or he's been out in the battle. That didn't make the king stop being king. And so, yeah, he can claim to be king for 20 years, and that's all fine and well. What really happens is he actually becomes king for like that last 5 years of his reign. And he's officially the king. Small problem. If you're supposed to be leading a military campaign, but you've been in the city for the past 15 years, and now the last 5 years of your reign, you're calling the troops back to your capital city. That's not a super great look. It's not a great sign that the king who just sat on the chair the longest is the one that gets to remain. And so it's one of those, doesn't look great because it's not great. And so, of course, he dies. He's overthrown, and we get Hoshea, not Hosea. It's Hoshea. That says Hosea. It's wrong. And so it's Hoshea. Hoshea is the last king. He reigns for 9 years. It's one of those where, again, we see the calendars are kind of weird. The way they count time is weird because he'll start in an even year and his reign ends in an even year. And so it's one of those, well, something's not right. Elementary math taught me that an even plus an odd is an odd. And so it's one of those that can't possibly be right. But what we see is it's probably he started in like December of 1 year, and then 9 years later, it's January now. That's still 9 years enough. And so it's like you're not saying, well, it's 9 years, 3 days, and 26 minutes. Like it's 9 years. And so it's one of those, we get to 722, and the Assyrians have surrounded the people. We'll go ahead and, for the last couple minutes of class, we'll read, we'll read 2 Kings chapter 17. If someone would like to start us off. Yeah, first one.
In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it.
In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them at Halah, and on the harbor, the river of Gozan, and then the cities of Medes. And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out for the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. The people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right, They built for themselves high places in their towns, from watchtowers to fortified cities. They set up for themselves pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. And they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this." Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers, and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets."
However, they did not listen, but stiffened their necks as they did their fathers, who did not believe the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant, which he made with their fathers, as well as his warnings that he gave them, and they followed vanity and became vain. They followed the nations which surrounded them, although the Lord had commanded that they were not to do as they did. They abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves cast images of 2 calves. And they made an Asherah idol and worshipped all the starry hosts of heaven and served Baal. They made their sons and their daughters pass through fire as human sacrifices and used divination to foretell the future and enchantments. And they sold themselves to do evil things in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. None of the tribes was left except the tribe of Judah. Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God either, but walked in the customs which Israel introduced. So the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and repeatedly afflicted them and handed them over to the plunderers until he had cast them out of his sight. When he had torn Israel from the royal house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king, and Jeroboam drove Israel away from the following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. For the Israelites walked in all the idolatrous sins which Jeroboam committed, they did not turn from them, until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, just as he had foretold through all his servants, the prophets. So Israel went into exile from their own land to Assyria to this day, the date of this writing.
All right, we can start there. So this is the story. This is the author of Kings likes to, or Tim likes, he decided to give us the rundown of everything that they did wrong. As if we had just stopped reading the past book and then, I guess, book and a half that he had just written. And if we had no idea of what the promises that had been made on the previous 2 books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, he is relaying it all out and he's laying it on thick. The people of Israel messed up. They did everything wrong. And it was, he even points it back to, yes, David's line also messed up. They did the same sins. That's why the northern kingdom was torn away. And the king that was chosen, the king that was put in place, led them further away from God. And that cycle just continued to happen over and over and over and over again, until they reached this point when Shalmaneser comes up and is brought up by God, it seems, to go and crush Samaria. It's one of those moments of there is no northern kingdom. This is really to the point, because it even alludes to Egypt being subject. We're in the light green area. Judah is alone now. Judah is the only remaining part. The people of Israel are led to the north, and from there they are sent in almost every which direction. It's one of those moments of there's not a whole lot of hope. There's not a whole lot of good news going on. What we'll see is we'll rewind back to the end of Amaziah's reign next week, and because there's a few kings I want to hit that Judah has, and of course there's more archaeological evidence for those guys too, because we're getting into an area, especially because one of the kings was a leper, and so his tomb had to keep being moved outside the city, and so his tomb was a little bit more preserved than the others. But that's for next week. What we see is, and we have a lot more prophets to talk about next week as well. And so what we see is the southern kingdom has reversed its path since Amaziah is the king. Amaziah made a big boo-boo. He made the southern kingdom subject to the northern kingdom. And so he messed up, but his descendants don't do the same. The blessings that are given to the descendants of David continues. The southern kingdom will continue to grow strong, and all its surroundings will change very. It will change rapidly, but also not really at all. They'll still be surrounded on every side by enemies or by their enemies. But it is interesting. Egypt is one of those empires who, ever since the Exodus, they have some prominence, but they're one of those that, we'll just side with whoever's on top. We'll side with the Assyrians. We'll side with the Babylonians. We'll side with the Persians. We're not going to be necessarily the ones to cause a rebellion or try and fight this power that we clearly know will destroy us, because yes, Egypt is powerful. It has a lot of wealth, and yes, it has great armies. But for the most part of their history, they're never at war, and so they're never developing better war tactics. They're never developing more deadly weapons. It's one of those where when you have the Assyrians and Babylonians and the Syrians and the Israelites and the Judeans, and they're all right there and they're all in tight contention. Of course, they're going to figure out, hey, maybe if I put someone with a bow and arrow on a chariot, that's even more deadly than just a guy with a sword on a chariot or a spear. And they start thinking of new tactics and better war machines. But of course, none of that matters when the Romans come in, because they perfected it to an art. And so anyway, it is interesting just because I'll point this out a couple more times. At least I find it interesting. I don't know how much you guys find it interesting. But the names of the pharaohs keep changing, like semantically. Like it's very much, this is not the same style of name as it was the last time. And so just as a peek behind the curtain, Egypt does struggle with these dynastic turnovers. And it's not necessarily like the Israelites where it was just some general took over. No, it's but the general was like 12th cousin to the king. No, it's this is a completely different segment of the racial population of Egypt has come to power. They're changing their language, and not to get off on Egyptian history, but they go through these cycles where, well, we can see it even just based off of minimal knowledge. Hieroglyphs were actually it was a very small portion of the Egyptian language for a part. And so at time it was the main language, but then it just became a ceremonial language, and their main languages kept changing, and it became a mess until you reach the Greeks, who come in and say, no, you're learning Greek, and you will like it. And then the Romans come in and say, no, we're learning Latin and you will like it. And so that's where they're at. But that's where we'll end class. Next week, we'll be talking about this period in Judah's time when it's Judah alone. And they are the remaining people of God in there. So, any questions? All right. Thank you guys for being here.